Greetings. Thanks for joining me in our last class on myth criticism. Today we will talk about a number of authors. The first one, Jessie Weston, then followed by Sir James Frazer, Northrop Fryer, Mircea Eliade, Robert Graves, and finally René Girard. These videos are being recorded as part of my critical theory class during the COVID-19 emergency. And I could not avoid starting with one of the well-known poems by T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. I'm recording this on March 25th, and April is just around the corner. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Unreal city under the brown fog of a winter's dawn. A crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. It sounds very much like what we're going through these days, sadly. Alongside his monumental poem, The Wasteland, Eliot included a number of explanations and notes, among them the following. Not only the title, but the plan and a good deal of incidental symbolism of the poem were suggested by Miss Jessie Weston's book on the Grail legend, From Ritual to Romance. Indeed, so deeply I am indebted to Miss Weston's book, I will elucidate the difficulties of the poem much better than my notes can do. And I recommend it, apart from the great interest of the book itself, to any who thinks such elucidation of the poem is worth the trouble. To another work of anthropology I am indebted in general, one which has influenced our generation profoundly. I mean The Golden Bough. I have used especially the 2 volumes, Adonis, Attis, Osiris. Anyone who is acquainted with these works will immediately recognize in the poem certain references to vegetation ceremonies. Jessie Weston was an English medievalist working mainly on the Arthurian legend. Her book, From Ritual to Romance, was published in 1920 and was influenced by Sir James Frazer, The Golden Bough. Frazer was the first scholar to describe in detail the relations between myths and rituals, one of them being the fertility rite related to the annual sacrifice of the Year King or Fisher King, which appears in the Arthurian legend and represented the symbolic cycle of life, death, and rebirth related to, for instance, to the Osiris death to restore fertility in the Nile Valley in Egyptian culture. In the Arthurian legend, the Fisher King, also known as the Wounded King or the Maimed King, is the last in a long line in charge of keeping the Holy Grail. Versions of this story vary widely, but he is always wounded in the legs or groin and incapable of standing, possibly because of the supernatural powers of the Grail. The Fisher King can only fish in a small boat on the river near the castle of Corbenic. The name comes from French corps bénit, or blessed body, referring to the body of Christ. He waits for some noble, and in some accounts it's Percival or a knight from Arthur's court, to arrive and heal him by asking a certain question, and then take charge of keeping the Grail. In Act 1, Scene 1 of King Lear's Shakespeare wrote that nothing will come of nothing. This line is echoed in Eliot's The Waste Land, when he says in line 752, I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands, my people humble people who expect nothing. In James Joyce's episode 12 of the Ulysses, known as the Circe episode, the two protagonists of the story, Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom, are in a brothel in Mabbot Street, Dublin. The two are very drunk and have hallucinations. At one point, Stephen hits one of the lamps with his cane and shouts, "Nothing," which also echoes the shout in The Waste Land and in Siegfried's Nothing, as he forges his sword in Wagner's Darin des Nibelungen, Act 1, Scene 3. Appearing first in Chrétien de Troyes, Percival ou le Comte de Galle in 1180, the story of the Fisher King and the Grail was later incorporated into the Arthurian myths. At first, it was presented as a retelling of the older Fisher King tale. One version involved Percival encountering the Fisher King and the Grail before arriving at Camelot. For more information, you can visit the website of Rochester University, where you can find essays on the Fisher King and some bibliography. The Fisher King is crippled and his lands are desolate, infertile as a result of his own physical and psychological illness. Percival heals the king, restoring the land to fertility and becoming keeper of the Grail. Following Fraser, Weston connects the story of the Fisher King to ancient fertility rituals, linking the king's health to that of his land. However, the Fisher King of medieval Romance cycles, as well as the Waste Land, is not only a symbol of life, but also of suffering without the option of death, as in the myth of Sisyphus. Percival is also one of the protagonists in Virginia Woolf's novel The Waves. The reason I'm mentioning all these connections is so that you can do a little research on your own and see where all this leads. In the case of The Waste Land, although the Fisher King is not directly named, Eliot alludes to him indirectly in several instances that you can find listed on your slide. We're going to introduce the figure of Sir James Fraser, who was a very influential person, a Scottish social anthropologist who studied at the University of Cambridge and was knighted in 1914. He worked mainly on mythology and comparative religion, and his book, The Golden Bough, published in 1890, connects the beginning of organized religion to pagan fertility rituals. The book presents the evolution of religious beliefs in a comparative way across different cultures. Fraser posited that human belief progressed through three stages: primitive magic, replaced by religion, and in turn replaced by science. Fraser explains that the earliest humans believed in magical acts and associated them with rituals and myths, believing in gods, sometimes family ancestors, sometimes mythic heroes descending from the gods, all of which were the founders of a tribe or clan. Gradually, religion largely replaced these magic beliefs, often associated to nature cults and fertility cycles of the crops. And religion gave rise to normative structures for the growing of society. In turn, It was replaced by science, with mathematics replacing numerology, astronomy coming out of astrology, and chemistry coming out of alchemy. Fraser presented a narrative of secularization as well as one of the first expressions of disenchantment. The growing emphasis on empiricism and reason-based studies found more and more difficult to incorporate invisible aspects, not ruled by consciousness, for example, imagination and intuition. In spite of the Romantic attempt to recover psychological, supernatural, and paranormal accounts, the so-called narratives of enchantment were pushed aside as pseudoscience. The theme of disenchantment will be the object of other lectures related to the fantastic and forthcoming. In one of those, we shall explore the relationship between Max Weber's references to disenchantment and his emphasis on workers laying the ground for science by their practical approaches to cultivate nature, and also how this topic was taken by the Marxist school of criticism known as the Frankfurt School, mainly Theodor Adorno. But this will be the topic of another lecture, as I have just mentioned. Fraser was the first scholar to describe in detail the relations between myths and rituals. His vision of the annual sacrifice of the year king is related to the archetype of the sacrifice king hero that functions as a scapegoat. For example, the figure of Christ in Christian religion and similar figures that appear in other religions as well as literary representations, such as Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, Shakespeare's Hamlet, or King Lear. Fraser's book on Totemism and exogamy from 1910 also influenced Sigmund Freud's Totem and Taboo, which was published in 1913. As indicated, in prospective lectures, we shall explore the topic of the mask in relation to Jung's theories and also Jung's impact on the fantastic and on science fiction. In turn, we will also deal with the revivals of forms of enchantment in recent popular culture. Among the myths collected by Fraser in The Belief in Immortality and the Worship of the Dead, published in 1913 by Macmillan, is the story of the two messengers. Fraser refers to the occurrence of this myth in several African cultures, like the Bantu, the Zulu, and the Bura in Nigeria. Two messages are carried from the Supreme Being to mankind, one of eternal life and one of death. The messenger carrying the tidings of eternal life is delayed, and so the message of death is received first by mankind, usually carried by a malicious, lizard-like figure which echoes the archetype of the trickster. The following slide, I leave it up to you to make the connections. All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. "I see somebody now," she exclaimed at last, "but he's coming very slowly, and what curious attitudes he goes into." For the messenger kept skipping up and down and wriggling like an eel as he came along with his great hands spread out like fans on each side. "Not at all," said the king. "He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger, and those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes. He only does them when he's happy. His name is Haga." He pronounced it so as to rhyme with mayor. "I love my love with an H," Alice couldn't help beginning, "because he's happy. I hate him with an H because he's hideous. I fed him with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Hi-Ha, and he lives on the hill the king remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was still hesitating for the name of a town beginning with H. The other messenger is called Hatta. I must have two, you know, to come and go. One to come, one to go. The first to theorize archetypal criticism in purely literary terms was the Canadian critic Northrop Fryer. Fryer's major work, Anatomy of Criticism, takes from a previous essay entitled The Archetypes of Literature, which he had published in 1951. In Anatomy of Criticism, from 1957, Fryer explains that literature forms an objective system that could be analyzed scientifically. As a structuralist, Fryer conceived governing laws which appear as basic structures and which in turn are universal patterns or archetypes. These archetypes, a term he borrowed from Carl Jung, are a bridge between cultural ideologies and social imagination. According to Fryer, the aim of criticism is not to pass value judgment on literary works, but rather trace the evolution of these metaphors, which do not always contain ideas, but also the history of human emotions in a particular culture. And you have there a quote from Fryer from Words with Power. Central structure principles that literature derive from myth, the principles that give literature its communicating power across the centuries through all ideological changes. Such structural principles are certainly conditioned by social and historical factors and do not transcend them, but they retain a continuity of form that points to an identity of the literary organism distinct from all its adaptations to its social environment. Fryer uses the term centripetal and centrifugal to describe his critical method. Criticism reflects these movements centripetally, focusing on the aesthetic function of literature, centrifugally on the social functions of literature. Fryer had gained international fame 10 years before Anatomy of Criticism with his first book, Fearful Symmetry, which he had published in 1947. This book led to the reinterpretation of the poetry of William Blake. The title, it comes from a line in Blake's poem, The Tiger. The idea that the base of society is not ideological but mythical was first introduced by Giambattista Vico in his work Scienza Nuova, where he posited a view of language as fundamentally figurative. For Vico, poetic discourse is prior to other forms of discourse, such as philosophical. It is interesting that today research on cognitive metaphor posits the same thing. Along these lines, myths can be seen to carry metaphorical elements that are not just ideological and have a transformative power in society. In the third essay that forms part of Anatomy of Criticism, Fryer organizes his theory around the metaphor of human desire and frustration, including paradise religious imagery as ultimate fulfillment, and demonic imagery and perversion as frustration. He sees three recurring patterns of symbolism: analogical, demonic, and apocalyptic. Blake's influence is visible in Fryer's conception of the apocalyptic related to the analogy of innocence and the demonic and tyrannical to the analogy of experience. Fryer then identifies the mythical mode with the apocalyptic, the ironic with the demonic, and the romantic and low mimetic with their respective analogies. The high mimetic then occupies the center of all four. This ordering allows Fryer to replace the modes in a circular structure and point to the cyclical nature of myth and archetypes. In this setting, literature represents the natural cycle of birth, growth, maturity, decline, death, resurrection, rebirth, and the repetition of the cycle. Frege identifies these formulas as the conventional myths and metaphors, which he calls archetypes. He asserts that this conceptual framework is not derived from an ideological system, but rooted in imagination itself. As artifacts of imagination, literary works include, and this is a quote from Frege, from Archetypes, the pre-literary categories of ritual myth and folk tale, which form, in his vision, a potentially unified imaginative experience. He reminds us that literature is the, and again I quote, the central and most important extension of mythology. Frege's systematization of literature begins with three aspects of poetry given by Aristotle in his Poetics: mythos, that is the plot, and ethos, the characterization setting, and dianoia, the theme or idea. Like Vico, Frege speaks of 5 literary modes, identified with specific cultural periods and civilizations, which are the following: mythic, romantic, high mimetic, low mimetic, and ironic, all in relation to the ethos, which relates narrative point of view and its environment. And you can see the chart on your screen. Frege explains, and you have the quote on your screen, that the 4 mythoi that we're dealing with, comedy, romance, tragedy, and irony, may now be seen as 4 aspects of a central unifying myth. Conflict is the basis or archetypal theme of romance. Catastrophe is the archetypal theme of tragedy. Confusion and anarchy, the archetypal theme of irony and satire. The recognition of a newborn society rising in triumph around a still somewhat mysterious hero and his bride is the archetypal theme of comedy. Furthermore, Frege speculates that contemporary fiction may be undergoing a return to myth, completing a full circle or recursion, as Vico is the expression used by Vico. Frege's ideas of a central unifying myth are also very close to Joseph Campbell's conception of the monomyth, which we saw in our previous video. To explain in more detail, tragedy is concerned with the hero's separation from society. Mythic tragedy deals with the death of the gods. Romantic tragedy features elegies mourning the death of heroes. High mimetic tragedy presents the death of a noble human. Low mimetic tragedy shows the death or sacrifice of an ordinary human being. The ironic mode often shows the death or suffering of a protagonist who is both weak and pitiful compared to the rest of humanity. Frege explains that, and this is a quote, "It is a commonplace of criticism that comedy tends to deal with characters in a social group, whereas tragedy is more concentrated on a single individual." And he adds that the phases of tragedy move from the heroic to the ironic, and the first 3 corresponding to the first 3 phases of romance, the last 3 to the last 3 of irony. After tragedy, he deals with comedy, and he explains that comedy is concerned with the integration of society. Mythic comedy deals with the acceptance into society of the gods, often through a number of trials or through salvation. In romantic comic modes, the setting is pastoral or idyllic, and there is an integration of the hero with an idealized, simplified form of nature. In high mimetic comedy, there is a strong central protagonist who constructs his or her own society. In low mimetic comedy, we have the social elevation of the hero or heroine, and which often ends in marriage. And in ironic comedy, we may offer biting satire of a society or inflict pain on a helpless victim who fails social integration. Concerning romance, Fry explains that literature claims divine as inspiration through the gods, prophets, charms, incantations, and so on. And he explains that romance is the nearest of all literary forms to the wish fulfillment dream, and for that reason, it has socially a curious paradoxical role. I'm quoting. The essential element of plot in romance is adventure, which means that romance is naturally a sequential and processional form, he says. Another quote from the romance section. The complete form of romance is clearly the successful quest, and such a completed form has three main stages: the stage of the perilous journey and the preliminary minor adventures, the crucial struggle, usually some kind of battle in which either the hero or his foe or both must die, and the exaltation of the hero. The central form of the quest romance is the dragon-killing theme, exemplified in stories such as St. George's or Perseus. And of course, in the Bible, we have a sea monster usually named Leviathan. So these are all quotes from Northrop Frye on the section of romance that you have on your slide. And as you can see, they have very many similarities with the monomyth that we saw in the previous lecture on Joseph Campbell. And the last quotation, romance, like comedy, has 6 isolatable phases: the myth of the birth of the hero, number 2, the innocent youth of the hero, number 3, the normal quest theme, number 4, the maintaining of the integrity of the innocent world against the assault of experience, number 5, a reflective idyllic view of experience from above, number 6, the end of a movement from active to contemplative adventure. And finally, in the high mimetic mode, society is structured around an important city. In the low mimetic, thematic expositions tend towards individualism, introspection, and phenomenological epiphany, for example, as in Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And in the ironic mode, the poet tries to become more detached and observe from a relativistic perspective, and texts are discontinuous and anti-epiphanic. And in this case, an example can be Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, and which, of course, all these are suggestions for you to explore and in the works that you're going to, in the research that you're going to carry in this class. According to Nordstrom Frye, myths reveal superior beings, heroes, and events, and the different literary genres exemplify these aspects aligned with natural seasons as well as psychological moods conveyed by the various literary atmospheres. And we have a quote: "One important detail in poetic symbolism remains to be considered. This is the symbolic presentation of the point at which the undisplaced apocalyptic world and the cyclical world of nature come into alignment, and which we propose to call the point of epiphany." Thus, according to Frye, and as you have on your screen, summer corresponds to romance, the ideal world, a world of desires where things are categorized as good or bad. Winter corresponds to irony and satire, and this is also the real world. It's both tragic and comic. It's based on disorder, confusions, and situations of inferiority. Then the autumn corresponds to the tragic epic, and it's based on catastrophe and to sudden change, and also to human isolation. And finally, spring corresponds to comedy, and this is the real world again, and its basis is triumph in situations of equality, human reintegration. Along these lines, Fry sees human evolution as represented in fiction as a journey of quest involving two movements: the movement from the summer ideal innocence to winter real experience, and a movement from the winter real experience to the summer ideal innocence. The similarities again with Campbell monomyth are evident, and Frye has also been a major influence on Harold Bloom, Margaret Atwood, and several other authors that we might explore in the course of this course on critical theory. We're moving now to another one of our authors, in this case, Mircea Eliade, a Romanian theorist and historian of religion, who published his first book in 1921. This was a fictional account, and it was called The Silkworm Enemy, and it was followed by How I Found the Philosopher's Stone. And 4 years later, he published autobiographical diary of a short-sighted adolescent. Between 1925 and 1928, Eliade attended the University of Bucharest at the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters, and he became interested in social anthropology and by the work of Fraser. In 1928, he spent a long period of time at the University of Calcutta in India, and he received a PhD with a thesis on yoga practices. As one of the figures of the Criterion Literary Society, Eliade was very radical in his political views, and he was arrested in 1939 and suffered exile in various European cities. After his wife's death in 1944, he moved to France with the daughter of his wife, whom he had adopted, and he began to teach at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. In 1950, he became a member of the Eranos discussion group under the leadership of Carl Jung. And in 1956, he moved to the United States, becoming professor at Chicago University and becoming a member of the so-called Chicago School. Eliade devoted his life to the study of comparative religions, looking at religion from a cultural perspective and exploring texts, rituals, festivals, sacred places, and so on. One of his books, The Sacred and the Profane, The Nature of Religion, published in 1956, explained the distinction between the sacred and the profane, which he considers lies at the core of religious experiences. The profane refers to this world, the real world, and the sacred refers to the other side, the divine world. The differentiation of sacred and profane comes originally from Emile Durkheim, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, a book from 1912, who used the distinction in his descriptions of the differences between totem and taboo in natural primitive societies. In Eliade's opinion, the most fundamental structure of religious experience is the experience of the sacred, which is the manifestation of transcendence and eternity. He noticed that the difference between the sacred and the profane could be found in every religion, and that there were many sacred places which normally were sites of pilgrimage. For example, in the Christian religion, Rome is the seat of the Vatican, Jerusalem, where Christ lived and taught, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where the tomb of the Apostle St. James is located, and so on. All these sacred sites around the world include also very ancient ones and primitive ones, such as Stonehenge in the United Kingdom, as well as those associated with different religions, such as Buddhism, Shintoism, Hinduism, and so on. The following is a quote from Eliade himself. The experience of the sacred space makes possible the founding of the world, where the sacred manifests itself in space, the real unveils itself. To designate the act of manifestation of the sacred, we have proposed the term hierophany, which means that something sacred shows itself to us. It could be said that the history of religions, from the most primitive to the most highly developed, is constituted by a great number of hierophanies. These are manifestations of the sacred in some ordinary object, a stone or a tree, to the supreme hierophany, which is, for example, for Christians, the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. In each case, explains Eliade, we are confronted by some mysterious act, the manifestation of something of a wholly different order, a reality that does not belong to our world, in objects that are integral part of our natural, profane world. As seen in this quotation, Eliade used the term hierophany to characterize the phenomenon of the sacred. The term hierophany signifies the manifestation of the sacred. It comes from Greek hiero, which means sacred, and phanain, which means to reveal. For instance, as in John Waterhouse painting The Annunciation, where the angel reveals itself to Mary. The following is a quotation from The Sacred and the Profane, page 21, by Eliade. When the sacred manifests itself in a hierophany, there is not only a break in the homogeneity of space, there is also a revelation of an absolute reality opposed to the non-reality of the vast surrounding expanse. The manifestation of the sacred ontologically founds the world. In the homogeneous and infinite expanse in which no point of reference is possible and hence no orientation can be established, the hierophany reveals an absolute fixed point, a center. Another term used by Eliade is epiphany. In this case, it refers to an emotional insight or illumination coming from the divine or the supernatural as inner psychological experience. For example, represented in Dante Gabriel Rossetti's painting Beata Beatrix. And I quote from Eliade's Myths, Dreams, and Mysteries. In imitation, the exemplary acts of God or a mythic hero, or simply by recounting their adventures, the man of archaic society detaches himself from profane time and magically re-enters the great time, the sacred time. Finally, another term, theophany. This is a more restricted one than hierophany. It refers to the external physical manifestation of the divine in a concrete situation. For example, in ancient cultures, illness or ailments that overcame humanity were attributed to the manifestation of the rage of God. An example of theophanies are the difficulties that the protagonist of John Bunyan's allegory Pilgrim's Progress has to surmount, as seen on your screen. Related to the sacred ground or location, a place with special characteristics, time becomes ritualized in the form of religious fests, festivals, pilgrimages that memorialize the holy, the sacred, in order to seek eternal transcendence. This takes place by means of individual as well as collective acts of remembrance. The following is a quote from Eliade's The Myth of the Eternal Return. According to Mesopotamian beliefs, the Tigris has its model in the star Anunit and the Euphrates in the star of the Swallow. A Sumerian text tells of the place of the creation of the gods, where the divinity of the flocks and grains is to be found. The Ural-Altaic peoples of the mountains, in the same way, have an ideal archetype in the sky. In Egypt, places were named after celestial fields. First, the celestial fields were known, then they were identified in terrestrial geography. Eliade went on to expand Jung's ideas and theorize a ritualized mythical return, which he termed the eternal return. The ritual served the purpose of transcendence by means of repetition. Examples of these rituals are the New Year ceremonies among Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and other Near Eastern peoples, and in general, all over the world. According to Eliade, the linear view of history and time is a modern construction, which is based on the eschatology of the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. To Eliade, the idea that there is a kind of channel between the regions, the profane and the sacred, the region of the mortals, the real world, and the region of the deities and the divine, the eternal world, is one of the fundamental structures in religious experience. And this channel is normally called the axis mundi, or axis of the world. The axis mundi links together the regions of the universe, and images of mountains, sometimes ladders, as in Jacob's ladder, or trees, the towers and of temples and ziggurats, the staircases, as in Staircase to Heaven. They give a concrete representation of this idea, this channel that establishes a connection between the heavens, the earth, and sometimes the underworld. This connection enabled the passage from one level to another, from one mode of existence to a higher or a lower mode. According to Mesopotamian and later biblical accounts, they allowed a movement and communication between cosmic regions. For example, in the Enuma Elish, one of the oldest accounts of creation, a Sumerian text, the god Marduk builds his temple in Babylon, and the temple serves to unite three cosmic realms. And this is explained by Eliade in his book Images and Symbols, Studies in Religious Symbolism, in pages 50-56, 115-119. In antiquity, religious leaders like shamans, magic men, witch doctors could communicate with the divine through rituals performed at these sacred world centers. Some examples of these special axis mundi locations are Mount Olympus for the Greeks, or the Tree of Life in many different cultures. For example, the Yggdrasil of the Nordic, Scandinavian and Viking cultures, or even the Tree of Knowledge in the Garden of Eden for Christianity. Indeed, there are also references to cosmic pillars present in many biblical sources. For example, the book of Job states, "The pillars of heaven tremble and are bewildered at his rebuke." In Psalm 11:4, the temple is depicted as a pole between heaven and earth. And I quote, "Yahweh in his holy temple, his throne in heaven." And a similar image appears in Jacob's dream when he sees a stairway set up on the earth with its top reaching the heavens in Genesis 28:12. Several other examples of Axis Mundi can be seen on your screen. Alongside the different forms of Axis Mundi, including the Tree of Life, another sacred location is the garden. For example, in Genesis 2:3 and in Ezekiel 28:11-19, there are two biblical accounts that present a transition from the harmonious primordial existence to a separated and thus imperfect reality. Each story attributes this shift to wrongdoing on the part of the humans, disobedience. The Genesis narrative describes first the harmony in the Garden of Eden and then the expulsion of the first couple, Adam and Eve, from this ideal divine habitation after the transgression of God's commands. In Genesis, also the cherubims are guardians of the Tree of Life, and we can see this in Genesis 3:24. And the gates or threshold define a kind of boundary between the celestial and territorial world and emphasize the fundamental distinction between the world of the divinity and that of humans. As we have explained in Eliade's interpretation, the ritual, it's a way to connect, to remember these mythical times where there was a connection with transcendence, with the origins, with our origins. And this is explained in his book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, mostly. But also in Myths, Dreams, and Mysteries, Eliade indicates that the mythical time was the origin of time itself, and that in ancient societies, myths represented the absolute truth about this primordial time, this real time. He goes on to add that these myths of origins are always an account of creation. And this is a quote from Myths, Dreams, and Mysteries, page 6. The mythical time was the time when the sacred first appeared and established the structure and order of the world. And so myths of origins, according to Eliade, are accounts of the origin of the sacred itself. And the eternal return, the myth of the eternal return, the possibility of establishing a ritual to reconnect with the sacred, to reconnect the profane, the world of humans, with the world of divinity, the sacred. It's exemplified through these rituals. Eliade considers that myth is a solidified memory of metaphorical occurrences and situations that existed, and he uses this expression in illo tempore, in primordial time. So myth-telling and later recitations and literature in general help humans to recollect and remember these occurrences, and also to recognize the same patterns repeating in our lives. Well, I'm just going to mention very briefly the figure of Robert Graves. He was a poet, historical novelist, and a critic, and his father had been a celebrated Irish poet and a figure in the Gaelic revival. Both him and his father were interested in Irish mythology. Graves' mother had German origins, and this created some difficulties for him during First World War. So he decided not to use the middle name von Ranke, and which he had used during his education, schooling, and also in the publication of some of his early works. At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Graves enlisted almost immediately, taking a commission in the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. At the Battle of Somme, he was badly wounded by a shell fragment and he almost died. So he was hospitalized along his friend Siegfried Sassoon, a fellow officer in his regiment. They were both taken to Somerville College in Oxford, which was used as hospital for officers. And both suffered from shell shock. Some accounts of the war experiences appear in a narrative entitled Goodbye to All That, which Graves published in 1929 and republished with some revisions in 1957. But after the war, in 1919, Graves had taken up courses on literature at the University of Oxford. And in 1926, he took up a position of professor of English at Cairo University. He traveled there accompanied by his then wife and children and the poet Laura Riding. Soon after, he split from his wife and he remained a companion of Laura Riding for some time. In 1934, he published his most commercial successful work, I, Claudius, which was converted into a BBC television series of great success during the 80s. Graves and Riding left for Mallorca in 1936 at the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, and in 1939 they moved to the United States. After splitting also with Laura Riding, he returned to Mallorca in 1946 with a new wife and children, and they settled there until his death in 1985. The White Goddess, a historical grammar of poetic myth, was published in 1948. And this is one of his works on myths. And he also published in 1955 the Greek myths, which retells a large body of Greek myths with extensive commentary. In the following years, he turned mostly to writing fiction. So let me say a few words about the White Goddess, which represents an approach to the study of mythology from a creative and idiosyncratic perspective. Here, Graves proposes the existence of a European deity, the White Goddess, of birth, love, and death, and it's a kind of mother goddess, and inspired and represented by the phases of the moon. And Graves argues that this goddess was worshipped under various names. His research was first inspired by Sir James Frazer, The Golden Bough, and Graves concluded in the second edition of his book that the male-dominant monotheistic god of Judaism and its successors had been the cause of the White Goddess downfall. Some scholars, particularly archaeologists, historians, and folklorists, have rejected the work as poorly documented. In response to critics, Graves accused literary scholars of being psychologically incapable of interpreting myth. He argued that his methodology, which he termed iconotropy, he used a comparative approach to ancient images, and this comparative method was meant to capture the nature of the sacred by reducing speech to its original images and rhythm. He claimed that in order to see all the goddesses as one and the same representation of the sacred feminine, one had to combine all the images on several simultaneous levels of thought. According to Graves' biographer and nephew, Richard Percival Graves, Laura Riding played a crucial role in the development of Graves' thoughts when writing The White Goddess, despite the fact that the two were no longer together at that point. In fact, after the publication of the book, Laura Riding was furious, claiming that he had appropriated many of her thoughts and ideas. So this is a topic that maybe you can research a little bit further. The book was a major influence on the thinking of certain poets such as Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, and has inspired the so-called goddess movement, which encompasses neo-pagan beliefs and practices. Well, finally, the last author to be explored in this session, the last lecture on myth criticism, it's René Girard, a French historian and literary critic and philosopher of science, who performed a wide-ranging investigation on the central role of desire in culture. He believed that human development occurs initially through a process of observational mimicry, where the infant develops desire through a process of learning to copy adult behavior. All conflict, competition, and rivalry, therefore, originates in mimetic desire, which is the term that he uses, mimetic desire, which eventually reaches destructive stages of conflict, both between individuals and social groups, that sometimes this conflict requires to blame someone or something in order to diffuse conflict. And here is where Girard formulates the scapegoat mechanism. So he explores classical tragedies such as Medea or Oedipus Tyrannus, and he concludes that ritual sacrifice in ancient cultures often involve efforts of a given society to put all the blame for the errors of the community on a particular victim, thus venting violence and aggressive behavior on the shoulders of this sacrificial victim or a scapegoat. He adds that the ritual victim must be seen also not simply as a superstition, but as the metamorphosis of earlier reciprocal violence. A communal violence, which, quoting Girard, was more deeply rooted in the human condition that we are willing to admit. End of quote. According to Girard, institutionalized religions gradually directed this scapegoat impulse on imaginary concepts such as Satan or demons, because in their absence, human conflict would escalate. Girard saw religion as an essential instrument of cohesion, believing that the primary purpose of sacred texts was to end the practice of human sacrifices. Girard occupied positions at Duke University and Bryn Mawr College between 1953 and 1957, after which he moved to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he was made full professor in 1961. 20 years later, he became a professor of French language and literature in Stanford University, where he stayed until his retirement in 1995. In the 90s, he developed further the mimetic model of relationship between violence and religion, which he had first introduced in his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, which he published in 1961. And then he began to study anthropological literature and propose his second great hypothesis, the scapegoat mechanism, which is the origin of archaic religion, and which he sets forth in his second book, Violence and the Sacred, which was published in 1972. The scapegoat mechanism had been used earlier by Kenneth Burke, this term, in Burke's book Permanence and Change, which was published in 1935. And it is also present to some extent in the work of Walter Benjamin that we will study when we explore Marxist criticism. According to Girard, the substitution of an immolated victim is a symbolic act that constituted one of the first instances of language among hominids. Girard also said that this is the first time that one thing represents another thing, standing in the place of this absent one. This substitution is the beginning of representation and language, but also the beginning of sacrifice and ritual. According to Girard, this is so. So his work is also attracting interest, increasing interest from empirical researchers investigating human cognition from the field of semiotics and neuroscience. One important figure, for instance, is Vittorio Gallese, professor of psychobiology at the University of Parma in Italy. The parallels between Girard's insights and the recent conclusions made by empirical researchers concerning imitation and mirror neuron structures in the brain are indeed remarkable. Girard's influence also extended beyond philosophy and social sciences to include the literary realm. A prominent example of a fiction writer who was influenced by Girard is the South African novelist John Maxwell Coetzee, who was a winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2003. So to conclude this last lecture on myth criticism, the third one of three, I would like to mention some of the current research that is taking place in this field at the University Complutense by the research group under the leadership of Professor José Manuel Losada from the French department. You can see there on your slide several of the projects and some of the books that have been published, edited by Losada and with contributions from the different members of the research teams, which include not only members from Complutense, but also from various other universities in Madrid and international teams as well. And I am part of this group as a researcher. We had been funded by Comunidad de Madrid to have several networks for the study of myth criticism. And we have hosted at Complutense and also in other participant institutions several conferences on different aspects of myth criticism related, for example, to emotions, to audiovisual creation, and so on. The team has a journal which is called Amaltea. Amaltea is a journal that is hosted at Complutense University, and it publishes articles in various languages, Spanish and also English mostly, but also French and so on. And it's in open access, so you can go online and download interesting articles from it. We also, the group of myth criticism also has an international association which is called Asteria, in which scholars exchange knowledge. And among the research projects, I can mention Athis Galatea, and the most recent one is called Aglaya, which has just started this year. Among my contributions to this research group, there is an edited collection of papers for a journal called Icono 14. You can actually see there the image. In this special issue, which I coordinated with a professor from Yale University, we worked on myth and technology, and this is why the title is called Technopoiesis. So thank you very much for your attention, and I do hope that you found these 3 lessons on myth criticism interesting.